First, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, especially Jelena and Dragana, for inviting me.
Okay.
Right. The epigrammatist Marshall, unlike many of his literary predecessors, was very interested in his poems as physical objects, scrolls and codices. He was interested in the way they are read and consumed, but also plagiarized and abused. As part of his interest in the material nature of literature, he also reaches back to the original inscriptional nature of epigram, playing with the conventions of stone and scroll. In a recent study, Alessandra Tafaro has argued that Marshall's concept of a general, anonymous reader is inspired by the anonymous passerby found in inscriptions. Similarly, the reader of epigrams is like the inscriptional viator, since they are both moving, one literally and the other metaphorically, through a world full of written words which are asking for their attention. The parallel which I would like to focus on today is what kinds of ideas do Marshall and the anonymous authors of verse epitaphs share about the immortality of poetry and the role of the reader in perpetuating the name and fame of the poet and the deceased. I will look at verbal and thematic parallels, but I do not intend to speculate about influence or precedence. To establish a framework of how Marshall engages with epigraphic conventions, I will first look at some epigrams which reproduce the form of a sepulchral inscription. These epigrams can be classified as proper sepulchral epigrams, or they could only be using the form of a sepulchral epigram to convey a different theme, such as imperial praise, satire, or metapoetics. In the second half, I will focus on programmatic poems, which are not necessarily in the form of an epitaph or even an inscription. I will first look at speaking inscribed epitaphs and their reliance on verbal communication as a way for the deceased to claim their space in the world and keep their memory alive. And we'll then look at Marshall's epigrams about his own readers to show that there's a similar claim that being read is the only way that a poet achieves fame, as well as an anxiety about facing oblivion because of neglect and abandonment. I will begin with an epigram which is generally considered to be a proper sepulchral inscription, uh, because it is occasioned by the death of an individual and treats an aspect of death for its own sake. Here I am buried, sorrow of Bassus, Urbicus, an infant, to whom most mighty Rome gave race and name. 6 months were missing from my first 3 years, when the stern goddess unkindly broke my threads. What use was to me my beauty, my talk, my age? You that read these lines give tears to my tomb. So may one whom you wish to survive you, not go down to Lethe's waters before they are older than Nestor. This epigram exhibits many elements characteristic of inscribed epigram. First, there's deixis, pointing to where the deceased is buried, Ike Gosum, followed by the name, Urbicus, son of Bassus, and some information about social status. It could be argued that Urbicus is a freeborn or at least the son of a freedman. Next come age and death, here 2.5 years. The praise for the deceased's skills and appearance are connected to a self-lamentation. And some other inscriptional commonplaces include addressing a reader and asking for his sympathy, and envious fates that end a life prematurely, and a prayer for the longevity of the reader and his loved ones. On the basis of epigrams such as this one, it has even been argued that Marshall may have been commissioned to compose actual inscriptional poetry, some of which may have survived as being written in his books. Other epigrams may take the form of an epitaph, but their main theme is not the commemoration of the deceased. One such example is the epitaph for Cornelius Fuscus, a Praetorian prefect who died in 87 during the Mission's Dacian campaign. The one who was the guard of the sacred person of Mars in a toga, to whom an army of our supreme leader was committed, here lies Fuscus. Fortune, this may be acknowledged. This stone no longer fears enemy threats. The Dacian has bowed his neck and received the mighty yoke, and a victorious shade possesses the captive grove. Although the poem is nominally about Fuscus, he is merely a background character in the praise of Domitian, who is a god on earth and the one who has truly subjugated the Dacians, at least in this poem. The epitaph is presumably imagined to be in Dacia, at the place where Fuscus died, although it could be speculated um, where this is supposed to be placed, at least like an idea of this epitaph is supposed to be placed, because are we meant to imagine that there is already an existing prosaic, basic funerary inscription for Fuscus, and this is sort of a supplement which was meant to be added later on the same stone or maybe next to it, sort of to commemorate not so much Fuscus's death, but Domitian's victory and his way of securing this place. Moving on, epigrams in the form of epitaphs for fictional and anonymous individuals are sometimes used to convey humor and satire. At least the scholar Christer Henriksson argues, or at least this is his idea. He says that he has no way to prove this, but that the epigrams commemorating a real person are meant to be taken seriously, whereas epigrams about a fictional character or anonymous, or epigrams about an unnamed person are meant to be taken as satire. This epitaph for an anonymous Matrona has hallmarks not only of inscriptions, but also of poetry most often associated with Martial. The marble you're reading, traveler, is small indeed, but will not yield to the stones of Mausolus and the pyramids. Twice I have participated in the secular games and lost nothing down to my dying day. Juno gave me 5 boys and as many girls. Their hands all closed my eyes. Rare glory of marriage was my lot, and my chastity knew only one penis. In the first 2 lines, the deceased woman addresses the anonymous passerby as a reader, which is nothing unusual for sepulchral inscriptions. But the ambition of the tiny marble to persist against grand monuments points to a larger theme. Martial's programmatic statements often make similar ambitious claims about how his poems are small but mighty when faced against grand genres such as epic, and how his poetry is more lasting than physical monuments. This is something I will return to later. Continuing along the epigram, we see that she is praised for her longevity through a reference to the secular games and having many children, which is common in epitaphs about married women. Finally, the praise for marital fidelity might come to a shock to a reader who was so far immersed in the solemn epitaph. But this also would not be shocking to a reader of Martial, since he is a poet known for both his obscene language and bold juxtapositions. The second half of this talk will examine if Martial might share some ideas about monumentality and permanence with verse epitaphs. As the previous epigram has demonstrated, Martial is capable of bringing the conversation about poetic immortality into an epigraphic context. Before moving to Martial, however, I will explore how inscriptional poetry conceptualizes this topic. Speaking epitaphs are interesting in this regard because they emphasize the importance of reading and verbal communication, actual utterance, for preserving the memory of the deceased individual. The concept of a speaking inscription is laid out in this epitaph for Atius Sophroniscus from Arelate, presumably 2nd or 3rd century AD. The one who invented writing lives on for eternity. After all, I would not know who lies in this here tomb. But the inscription speaks that which is written and cannot deceive. The basic job of the inscription is to convey accurate information about the deceased, but there is also the promise that eternity awaits those whose names are inscribed in the stone. The concept of a speaking stone refers to the fact that the reader is saying the contents of the inscription out loud, thus giving their voice to the deceased. In their most rudimentary form, speaking epitaphs ask the passerby to say the name and a hello or goodbye. In their more elaborate poetic form, they can sometimes be seen admonishing the passerby to stay a while and read the inscription out loud, such as the epitaph for Claudius Paulinus, found in Forum Livium. If you're traveling, rest here for a little from your toils. Why are you rushing so much? You will not be delayed while you read. Listen to the one who lives through your words and speaks through your soft voice. Besides the admonishment, you can also see that the reader is asked to perpetuate the memory of the deceased through their voice, which gives them a new life. Vivit. Another poetic version of this idea is found on the beginning of an epitaph from Trier. Date unknown. This inscription has also not been preserved, so we do not know much about its context. He who laments death, let him console his mind with love. Death was able to remove life. After death, however, renown survives and thrives. The body has died, but the name is on everyone's lips. The idea of the name on the lips of people is strongly reminiscent of Ovid's similar statements in the end of the Metamorphoses, as well as other poetic epitaphs such as Ennius. Within the context of inscriptions, this would refer to actually saying the name of the deceased out loud while reading. There is another very fragmentary inscription, which is probably in the same vein as the previous ones. It has been suggested that its meaning could be reconstructed through a comparison with this epigram from the Latin anthology. Do you want to know if a poet lives after his death? Look, I'm speaking what you're reading, and your voice really is mine. The endings of both lines are almost similar, besides the difference in scire in the inscription and nos in the epigram. The epigram offers a more playful variation of the idea that the deceased speaking through the voice of the reader, since the poet jokingly steals the voice from the reader and makes it his own. When it comes to Marshall's own claims of poetic immortality, the most characteristic thing is that he does not wait for posthumous fame. Marshall's predecessors, especially Ovid and other Roman elegists, look towards being immortalized by transcending the material, but still concede that they're constrained by the physical world. On the other hand, Marshall embraces the physicality of his poetry, as well as the fact that he depends on an ever-changing readership, which also makes him similar to authors of inscriptional poetry. Then it is no wonder that he opens his first book of epigrams with a pseudo-epitaph. Here he is, the one you read, the one you seek, Marshall, known all over the world for his witty little books of epigrams. Devoted reader, the glory you have given him while he lives and feels comes to few poets even after their deaths. Well, it does begin with a Deixis, hic est, and it is addressed to an anonymous reader. It is undercut through the claim that Marshall is alive while he has worldwide fame, and is not something he has gained after death. The one responsible for Marshall's fame is the reader, which evokes the centrality of the reader of epitaphs for perpetuating the memory of the deceased. The existence of readership is also important for a poet's validation, as Marshall reminds us in another epigram. They say that Cinna is writing little verses against me. The one whose poems no one reads is not an author. For both the deceased and the epigrammatist, having no one to read your writing becomes a fate worse than death, since it means facing oblivion and irrelevance. Tropes and phrases from epitaphs can also be employed in poems that do not formally imitate epitaphs and do not even have death as a theme. One such example is epigram 3-2, in which Marshall is warning his book to be careful when choosing who will be its recipient. Whose present do you wish to be, little book? Hurry to find yourself a protector, so that you won't be swiftly taken to a sooty kitchen to wrap sprats in your greasy papyrus or become a cone for incense or pepper. Similar to the previous epigram, This is another thing that happens to bad poetry. Its physical home, the papyrus, will get repurposed as wrapping paper. This is a trope that goes back at least to Catullus' poems on the Annals of Lucius, the infamous Cacata Carta. On the other hand, the theme of poetic death is signaled through the phrase citoraptus, which is otherwise used by martial and verse epitaphs to denote a person snatched away into the underworld. The Dark Kitchen is the new underworld for books of bad poetry, in which they're punished for having no readers to keep them alive. Finally, I will look at an epigram which brings together the threads of readership and monumentality. In it, personified Rome tells Martial about the importance of readers. Reader, you're my riches. When Rome gave you to me, she said, I have nothing greater to give to you. Through him you will escape ungrateful Lethe's idle waters and survive in the better part of yourself. The fig tree splits Messala's marble. The bold muleteer laughs at Crispus's halved horses. But thefts do not harm paper, and the centuries do it good. These are only memorials that cannot die. The reader is now someone who explicitly saves the poet from death, and we have seen from the previous epigram that death entails neglect and oblivion. If we recall the epitaph for the anonymous matron, which I've discussed a little bit earlier, we can see that a similar claim about defiance of a small inscription in the face of monumental architecture. This epigram is even more aggressive, however, since it foretells that monuments will face not only physical ruin, but also ridicule. On the other hand, things that are greatly detrimental to other physical objects, such as theft and the passage of time, are presented as harmless or even beneficial to literature. Flavian poets had a complicated relationship with monuments. Living in a city that was constantly expanding and building ever greater structures, some poets started to have doubts about the claims that literature would be more lasting than architecture. But they did not give up. The case of Martial shows how the engagement of a small poet with small monuments can create a productive vision of poetic mortality. In inscribed epitaphs, saying the name of the deceased out loud, greeting them and wishing them well were small gestures through which the dead were able to keep living in some form. In principle, Martial's epigrams are quite similar since they also rely on constant readership to drive away the specter of neglect and mockery. Thank you.